The sun had barely risen over the city of Fairview, yet Dr. Marcus Johnson was already wide awake, sipping his usual black coffee in the modest kitchen of his apartment. A towering figure at 6 feet 2 inches with a calm, authoritative demeanor, Marcus was known for his deep brown eyes that radiated compassion. His well-kept beard framed a face marked by years of dedication, sleepless nights, and countless moments spent comforting patients. At 38, Marcus had built a reputation as one of the best ER doctors in Fairview General Hospital, a beacon of hope for the city's underserved community. Born and raised in the heart of Fairview, Marcus grew up watching his mother work double shifts as a nurse while also volunteering at the local community center. Inspired by her selflessness, he had vowed early on to give back to his community. He excelled in school, earned a scholarship to a top medical school, and returned home to serve those who needed him most. Fairview General wasn't just a hospital to him. It was a symbol of resilience, a place where he could make a tangible difference every single day. His mornings were always busy. By 6 a.m., he was on his way to the hospital, weaving through the city's bustling streets. The sound of car horns mixed with the chatter of street vendors created a familiar symphony that accompanied his journey. But today felt different. There was a lingering tension in the air that Marcus couldn't quite place, something beyond the usual pressures of hospital life. Fairview General buzzed with activity from dawn till dusk. Nurses hurried through the hallways with charts in hand. Doctors conducted rounds, and the faint hum of medical equipment formed the backdrop. The hospital catered to a predominantly Black and Hispanic population, many of whom had limited access to healthcare. Marcus was often the first, and sometimes the only doctor patients could trust. He thrived in this environment, balancing compassion with efficiency, knowing each decision he made could save a life. But beneath this busy exterior lay a simmering issue. In recent months, Marcus had noticed subtle signs of unease within the community. There were murmurs about unfair policing practices in certain neighborhoods, stories of families being harassed for seemingly no reason. As someone who regularly dealt with victims of violence and trauma, Marcus couldn't ignore these stories. Patients arrived bruised and shaken, recounting their encounters with the police. Though Marcus never spoke out publicly, these experiences stirred something within him, a quiet rage at the injustice and a growing determination to protect his community beyond the confines of the ER. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Reeves had recently been assigned to Fairview's downtown precinct. Tall, with a clean-shaven face and piercing blue eyes, Daniel projected authority wherever he went. His crisp uniform, polished badge, and direct manner made him the ideal officer in the eyes of his superiors. But beneath that disciplined exterior lay an inflexible belief system, one rooted in maintaining order at all costs. His years on the force had hardened him, making him quick to judge and slow to empathize, particularly with communities he didn't fully understand. Daniel believed in strict law enforcement, viewing Fairview's underprivileged neighborhoods as hotspots for trouble. Despite this, he rarely interacted with the residents beyond issuing tickets or conducting patrols. To him, the hospital was a place where people went after they'd made bad choices. He didn't see it as a hub of hope and healing the way Marcus did. This disconnect between the cop and the doctor would soon bring their paths crashing together. The hospital staff whispered about Daniel's reputation. He was known for his tough stance on crime prevention, but there were also unsettling rumors that he targeted minorities, using minor infractions as pretext for bigger confrontations. Marcus had yet to meet Daniel, but the stories circulated by his patients painted a vivid picture, adding to the unspoken tension growing within the hospital and community. Conflict was brewing. It was only a matter of time before their worlds collided. And when it did, the ripple effects would be felt far beyond the hospital walls. It was a typical Friday afternoon, and Dr. Marcus Johnson had just finished a grueling double shift at Fairview General. Exhausted but satisfied, he left the hospital, ready to head home for a rare evening of rest. He barely made it 2 blocks from the hospital when he noticed the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. Confused, he slowed down and pulled over, his mind racing to figure out what he could have done wrong. As he rolled down his window, a stern voice barked from behind the blinding light of a flashlight. License and registration. Marcus turned to see Officer Daniel Reeves standing rigidly, his hand resting on his holster. The tension in the air was palpable. Marcus calmly handed over his documents, his voice steady but polite. "Officer, may I ask why I'm being stopped?" Daniel didn't immediately answer. He scrutinized Marcus's license with an exaggerated slowness before looking up, his gaze sharp. "There was a report of a suspicious vehicle matching your description," Daniel said, his tone curt. "A suspicious vehicle? I just left the hospital," Marcus explained, keeping his voice even. He pointed to the badge hanging from his rearview mirror. "I'm a doctor at Fairview General." But Daniel didn't seem to care. He leaned closer. "Doctor or not, I'm going to need you to step out of the car," he said coldly. The request stunned Marcus. He hesitated for a moment, then complied, stepping out onto the sidewalk. A small crowd began to gather, their murmurs growing as they recognized who Marcus was. Among them were hospital staff and patients who had witnessed Marcus's dedication firsthand. Daniel began a pat-down. "What exactly are you looking for, officer?" Marcus asked, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. "That's for me to decide," Daniel snapped. His tone was condescending, treating Marcus as though he were a criminal rather than a respected doctor. The murmurs grew louder, and Marcus could feel his composure slipping. He wasn't just a man being disrespected, he was a symbol for his community, and every action he took would be scrutinized. Marcus inhaled deeply, struggling to contain his frustration. He had faced countless emergencies, made life-or-death decisions, and yet, here he was, powerless, degraded, and judged solely by the color of his skin. His instinct was to speak out, to demand justice, but the weight of his professional integrity held him back. His mind flashed to the countless patients who looked up to him, the young black boys he mentored, and the hospital staff who respected him. He couldn't afford to lose control. "Officer Reeves," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm, "this is unnecessary. I've done nothing wrong. You're embarrassing me in front of my community for no valid reason." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "You think your title makes you untouchable?" he sneered. "Everyone follows the same rules." Marcus clenched his jaw, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for respect. I'm asking for basic decency." Daniel smirked, clearly enjoying his position of power. The crowd's murmurs turned into audible protests, but Daniel ignored them. Marcus, however, was acutely aware of every voice, every set of eyes watching him, waiting to see how he would handle this public humiliation. The incident shook Marcus to his core. Once Daniel finally let him go, claiming there was nothing to charge, Marcus got back into his car, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. The world outside blurred as he sat there, trying to process what had just happened. The hospital was supposed to be a place of healing, but now it felt like a war zone. His drive back was filled with self-doubt. Had he failed his community by staying silent? Had his composure been mistaken for weakness? By the time he arrived home, the weight of the encounter pressed heavily on his shoulders. His usual post-shift routine of unwinding was replaced by pacing and endless replaying of the incident. He questioned everything: his role as a leader, his ability to protect his patients, and his responsibility to speak out against injustice. That night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, staring at his stethoscope. It had always been a symbol of his calling, but now it felt heavier. He realized this wasn't just about him. It was about a systemic problem that went far beyond a routine traffic stop. And he couldn't stay silent any longer. The morning after the incident, the entire community buzzed with outrage. Videos of Officer Daniel Reeves disrespecting Dr. Marcus Johnson circulated rapidly across social media. The hashtag Justice for Dr. Johnson and hashtag End Racial Profiling were trending by noon, with local news stations picking up the story. Protesters gathered outside Fairview General Hospital and the police precinct, demanding accountability. Inside the hospital, tension simmered. Nurses whispered in hallways, doctors exchanged knowing glances, and patients offered their quiet support to Marcus. But it wasn't just the community rallying. Marcus's colleagues called for a formal statement from the hospital's board, urging them to take a stand. In a closed-door meeting, Dr. Eleanor Sanders, the hospital's chief of staff, addressed the growing unrest. This incident doesn't just affect Marcus, it affects all of us. Our silence will be seen as complicity, she stated, her voice steady. Despite this, there were murmurs of dissent. Some board members feared that siding with Marcus would jeopardize their relationship with law enforcement. Councilman David Brooks, a prominent figure in local politics, voiced his concern. We need to tread carefully. This is bigger than just one incident. Meanwhile, Officer Reeves faced mounting scrutiny. The Fairview Police Department launched an internal investigation as public pressure intensified. Reeves, however, remained defiant, claiming he acted within protocol. Yet the growing backlash was impossible to ignore. His superiors were no longer dismissing the incident as a misunderstanding. As the conflict deepened, Marcus found himself surrounded by a complex web of support and opposition. His closest ally was Dr. Maya Thomas, a fellow physician who had long admired Marcus's dedication. "You've always fought for this community, Marcus. Now let us fight for you," she urged, organizing a public forum to address the incident. On the other hand, Lieutenant Frank Keller, Reeves's superior, struggled to remain impartial. Though he privately questioned Reeves's actions, he publicly defended the department. "We can't let one incident tarnish our entire force," he declared during a press conference, even as his voice wavered under the weight of public scrutiny. Marcus's family also became involved. His father, Richard Johnson, a retired civil rights activist, voiced his unwavering support. "Son, we've fought battles like this before. You have a responsibility to stand tall," he said. Yet, Marcus's wife, Tasha, worried about the toll this fight was taking on their family. "You're already stretched thin, Marcus. Don't lose yourself in this," she pleaded, her eyes filled with concern. Even patients began speaking out. Mrs. Jenkins, a longtime patient of Marcus, shared her story with the local news. "Dr. Johnson saved my life. To see him treated like that, it's heartbreaking," she said tearfully. Despite the overwhelming support, Marcus wrestled with his own doubts. He sat in his office late at night, staring at the protest signs outside his window. Was he strong enough to carry this burden? Every part of him wanted to believe in justice, yet the weight of expectation was crushing. He recalled the look in Reeves's eyes, cold, dismissive, as if Marcus's years of service meant nothing. The humiliation gnawed at him, reopening old wounds he thought had healed. Memories of his early days in medical school, when he had to constantly prove his worth as a black man in a predominantly white institution, resurfaced. The anger was there too, bubbling beneath the surface. He wanted to confront Reeves, to demand an apology, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. This wasn't just about one man's ignorance. It was about a system that allowed such behavior to persist. Yet, amid the turmoil, a spark of resolve ignited. Marcus thought about the young black boys and girls in his community, looking up to him as a symbol of hope. He couldn't let them down. He couldn't let his family down. And most importantly, he couldn't let himself down. Determined to channel his anger into action, Marcus drafted an open letter to the community. He shared his experience not as a victim, but as a call to action. "We cannot let this define us, but we also cannot ignore it," he wrote. "Together, we must demand better." As Marcus pressed send on the letter, he knew there was no turning back. The community would rally harder. The hospital would face more pressure, and Reeves would be forced to confront his actions. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Officer Reeves watched the news coverage, his jaw clenched. His reputation, once untouchable, was now on the line. But instead of remorse, he felt resentment. He was convinced Marcus was using his status to turn the public against him. The stage was set for an inevitable confrontation, one that would force both Marcus and Reeves to face their deepest truths. Justice was no longer a distant hope. It was fast approaching. The hospital's main auditorium buzzed with tension. It was standing room only. Community members, hospital staff, police officers, and media representatives were all present. Dr. Marcus Johnson stood at the front, calm yet resolute. He had called for this public forum to address not only his experience, but also the broader issue of systemic injustice. "Today isn't just about me," Marcus began, his voice steady but powerful. "It's about every person who's been overlooked, disrespected, and devalued because of the color of their skin. And it's about those who have the power to change that." The room fell silent as Officer Daniel Reeves entered, flanked by his superiors. His presence drew murmurs, but Marcus remained composed. "Officer Reeves," Marcus said, locking eyes with him, "you disrespected me not because of who I am, but because of what I represent. Today, I'm asking you to see me, not as a threat, not as an enemy, but as a fellow human being." Reeves shifted uncomfortably. The weight of the moment was palpable. "I came here to listen," he said after a pause. "And to explain." His voice was guarded, but lacked its usual arrogance. As Reeves began to speak, his tone changed. "What I did was wrong. I disrespected you without knowing your story, your sacrifices," he admitted. "But what you don't know is why I reacted the way I did." He hesitated, visibly struggling. "Years ago, my father was a police officer. He was shot during a routine traffic stop by someone who looked like you." The room gasped, tension thickening. "I've carried that anger ever since. It blinded me to the truth that not every person of color is a threat, and not every situation is the same." Marcus stood still, absorbing the revelation. This wasn't the justification he had expected. Instead, it was a confession of deep-seated pain. "I let my personal trauma dictate my actions," Reeves continued. "But that doesn't excuse what I did. I was wrong to let my bias overshadow my duty to serve and protect everyone equally." His voice cracked slightly, the weight of his admission heavy. This unexpected vulnerability shifted the atmosphere in the room. The audience, initially there to support Marcus and demand accountability, now grappled with a more complex narrative of pain, prejudice, and humanity. Marcus took a deep breath, processing Reeves's words. He could feel the anger, the hurt, and the weight of systemic oppression that had been passed down through generations. Yet, beneath it all, he recognized something else, an opportunity for healing. "Officer Reeves," Marcus said, his voice soft but firm, "we both carry scars from different battles. But today, we have a chance to stop perpetuating the cycle of pain. Recognizing our biases is just the first step. The real work comes in choosing to act differently." Reeves nodded, visibly shaken. "I'm ready to do that work, but I can't do it alone," he admitted. The audience watched, captivated by the raw honesty unfolding before them. Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly patient who had publicly supported Marcus, stood up. "We all have wounds," she said, her voice trembling. "But healing starts when we confront them together." Applause erupted, a powerful symbol of the community's readiness to move forward. It wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about accountability, growth, and unity. Marcus turned to Reeves one last time. "Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about transformation. If you're willing to transform, so am I." He extended his hand. Reeves hesitated, then grasped Marcus's hand firmly. In that moment, the room seemed to exhale collectively. Though the journey ahead would be long and challenging, this confrontation marked a turning point, a shared recognition that justice could only be achieved through empathy, understanding, and a willingness to change. In the months following the public confrontation, Dr. Marcus Johnson made a commitment to rebuild trust within his community. He launched a series of community outreach programs designed to foster understanding between law enforcement and marginalized groups. The first initiative was a town hall meeting where Marcus brought together leaders from both the medical and law enforcement fields. The goal was simple: bridge the divide. For years, the hospital had been a place of healing, but now it would become a place for dialogue, too. The focus was on dismantling the prejudices that had led to incidents like the one with Officer Reeves. Through these gatherings, Marcus began to see the effects of his work. People of all backgrounds, including law enforcement officers, began to engage with one another. They shared their experiences, their fears, and most importantly, their hope for a future where respect and mutual understanding replaced suspicion and bias. Simultaneously, Marcus began advocating for policy changes within the hospital and citywide, ensuring that racial profiling and discrimination were addressed not just as individual issues, but as systemic problems needing long-term solutions. As for Officer Reeves, the road to redemption was long but necessary. After his emotional public admission, he took proactive steps to educate himself about racial bias. He attended diversity and inclusion seminars, read books about systemic racism, and sought counsel from mentors who had walked the same path before him. His transformation wasn't immediate, but it was profound. Reeves began volunteering with Marcus's outreach programs, not as a representative of the police force, but as an individual committed to change. He attended community events, listened to the stories of those he had previously wronged, and used his platform as a cop to speak about the need for reform within the police force. One day, Reeves stood alongside Marcus at a community event, sharing his own experiences of growth. "I never realized how much of my judgment was clouded by the pain of my past," he admitted, his voice steady but vulnerable. "But I'm learning to see the world differently. And I'm here to show up for you, the same way you've shown up for me." As the weeks turned into months, Marcus reflected on the journey he had been through. The anger that had initially consumed him had softened, replaced by a deep sense of purpose. He had faced down injustice not only for himself, but for the community that had entrusted him with their trust and their health. What had begun as a confrontation rooted in disrespect had evolved into a transformative experience for both him and the community. The power of resilience, of standing up for what's right, had proven stronger than the forces of hate and division. "I never thought a single moment could change so much," Marcus thought to himself one quiet evening. But change doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens in every conversation, every effort to make things better. And I'm committed to making it happen. The story closed on a hopeful note. In the town's central square, the sun was setting on a large community gathering. People from every walk of life had come together to celebrate the progress made. Marcus stood beside Officer Reeves, their hands clasped as a symbol of their mutual commitment to justice and healing. Children of all backgrounds played in the park, their laughter ringing through the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had once defined this very town. A large banner hung in the background, "Together for Unity, Together for Justice." As the community leaders made speeches, Marcus looked over the crowd, feeling a profound sense of peace. It wasn't perfect, and there was still much work to be done. But in that moment there was hope. Hope that change was possible when people were willing to confront their own biases, to speak truth to power, and to take responsibility for the injustices of the past. The sunset, symbolic of a new beginning, cast its warm light over the gathered crowd. Unity, healing, and justice had taken root, and this was just the beginning. Thank you for watching this powerful story of justice and transformation. If this inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that highlight the strength of standing up for what's right. Let's keep the conversation going. Drop your thoughts in the comments below.